The room hummed with tension, a low electric charge that made every journalist, lobbyist, and aide in the chamber hold their breath. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the congressional hearing room, catching the dust motes suspended in the air, giving the space an almost ethereal glow, but the atmosphere was anything but serene. At the center, Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat with the weight of decades of institutional failure behind her. The hum of cameras and the clicking of pens fell silent as she took the podium, her eyes scanning the packed room with a mixture of resolve and quiet fury. For years, whispers had circulated about the extent of the Epstein scandal, about how the powerful protected themselves while victims' voices were silenced. But today, Jasmine was not here to whisper. She was here to expose, to confront, to tear the veil of deception that had cloaked public figures for far too long. Every inch of her posture radiated authority. Every measured step toward the microphone was deliberate, as though she was stepping into the center of a storm she had been tracking for months. She thinks she can hide behind titles, behind rhetoric. Jasmine began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of righteous indignation. Pam Bondi used her office not to protect justice, but to protect the powerful. She attempted to bury the truth about Jeffrey Epstein, about his crimes, his network, his enablers, and she did it while claiming to uphold the law. A ripple ran through the room. Reporters leaned forward, the recorders capturing every syllable. Some officials shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Bondi herself remained seated across the room, her face carefully composed, but Jasmine's words cut through the pretense like a scalpel. The normally impenetrable facade showed cracks subtle at first, a tightening around the eyes, a flicker of tension in the jaw. Jasmine's hands rested lightly on the podium, fingers brushing over stacks of documents and printed memos. She had spent months piecing this together: internal DOJ communications, witness statements, corroborating emails, every shred meticulously compiled into a narrative that was as damning as it was undeniable. "You think the public won't notice," Jasmine continued, her gaze sweeping the gallery. "That decisions made in secret, under the guise of bureaucracy, were actually calculated to shield a predator and his associates. You underestimated the people you swore to serve. You misjudged the power of accountability." The room was tense, almost unbearably so. Every eye was on her. A camera caught the faintest quiver in Bondi's hand, the only acknowledgment of the storm bearing down upon her. Yet Jasmine did not flinch. This was not a performance. This was a reckoning. Outside the hearing room, news feeds had already begun lighting up. Twitter, live broadcasts, and breaking news alerts spread the first whispers of the confrontation, turning what was meant to be a closed-door hearing into a national spectacle. The public, long hungry for transparency in the Epstein case, felt the surge of adrenaline as Jasmine's words cut through months of obfuscation. Her voice softened for a moment, tempered with gravity, drawing the human toll into sharp relief. The victims were silenced, their pain ignored, and the very office sworn to uphold justice turned a blind eye. "That ends today." There was a pause, pregnant and electric, as the weight of her declaration sank in. The chamber seemed to hold its collective breath. Jasmine stepped back slightly, letting the silence amplify the gravity of the moment. She could feel history in the making, the shift in power, the subtle tremor in the public consciousness. Bondi finally spoke, her voice controlled but tinged with a defensiveness that betrayed unease. "I have always acted in accordance with the law. No evidence has been intentionally withheld." Jasmine's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in deliberate focus. "The memos tell a different story. Your actions were calculated, your intent clear. Justice was not your priority. Protection was." A murmur rippled through the chamber. The media captured it all: the tension, the confrontation, the moral stakes laid bare. The narrative was set. This was not merely a clash of political wills, but a battle for truth, for accountability, and for the very soul of justice in America. As she returned to her seat, Jasmine's expression softened just slightly, a moment of human reflection amid the storm. The first salvo had been fired. A nation would be watching, dissecting, judging, and she would be relentless dot in that charge. Silence. The room seemed to acknowledge a new reality. The era of hidden power was being challenged, and Jasmine Crockett was at the forefront of a reckoning that would shock America. Bondi leaned back in her chair, the courtroom lights catching the faint glimmer of steel in her cufflinks, a symbol of authority that now felt fragile under the weight of exposure. The veneer of composure she had maintained for months began to show tiny fractures. Every eye in the chamber was fixed on her, measuring, judging, waiting for a slip that would confirm what Jasmine had already claimed, that this was more than bureaucratic inefficiency. This was a calculated effort to hide the truth. Jasmine watched Bondi closely, reading the subtle cues, the tightening of her shoulders, the controlled exhale, the eyes that flickered briefly toward her team before returning to the witness stand. "Let's not pretend this was just paperwork delays," Jasmine said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that cut through the polite murmurs in the room. "Internal memos, emails, and testimony from your own office show that you were actively involved in decisions that withheld information about Epstein's activities. How do you justify that?" Bondi's response was careful, almost rehearsed. "The Department of Justice operates under strict protocols. Delays happen due to review procedures, legal assessments, and confidentiality considerations. At no point was there intent to mislead the public." Intent, Jasmine thought, as she sifted through the papers before her, was precisely what the documents revealed. Intent? "You call this intent?" She countered, her voice rising just slightly, not with anger, but with the weight of truth. She tapped a specific memo, pushing it across the polished surface of the podium toward the recorders. "This email, sent directly from your office, instructs the FBI to withhold records citing strategic discretion." Strategic discretion, Miss Bondi, while victims of Epstein were denied justice. Bondi's lips pressed into a thin line. Her aides shuffled papers, a small display of nervous energy, but she maintained her composure. "There are circumstances that require careful consideration," she replied, each word measured, like placing bricks in a wall meant to shield her from the truth. But the memos were just the beginning. Jasmine had prepared a cascade of corroborating evidence, time-stamped messages showing repeated instructions to delay the release of information, handwritten notes on sensitive files that traced back to Bondi's office, and accounts from staffers who had grown uncomfortable with the legal gymnastics surrounding Epstein's cases. Every piece added weight to a narrative that Bondi could not easily dismiss. "You claim procedures," Jasmine continued, her voice low now, drawing the room into an intimate, almost conspiratorial quiet. "But the pattern here is undeniable. Files hidden, witnesses discouraged, records delayed. Your office was the gatekeeper keeping the truth locked away. How do you sleep at night knowing the victims were silenced while you sat on critical evidence?" The courtroom shivered with tension. Journalists scribbled furiously. Cameramen adjusted lenses, capturing the interplay of accusation and denial. Outside, social media exploded, live feeds relaying every exchange as millions tuned in to witness a confrontation that felt historic, almost cinematic in its gravity. Bondi's eyes flickered, betraying the first hint of vulnerability. "I acted to ensure the integrity of the legal process," she said finally, her voice steady but a fraction less confident. "That is my responsibility as Attorney General." Jasmine leaned forward slightly, voice calm but cutting. "Integrity cannot coexist with silence. Ms. Bondi, you had a responsibility to the law, yes, but also to the people it serves. The memos, the directives, The deliberate pauses in releasing information. This was not integrity. It was protectionism. It was shielding a predator while the public was denied the truth. A hush fell over the room. Even those accustomed to political theater sensed the magnitude of what was unfolding. This was more than a clash of personalities. It was a confrontation between accountability and evasion, between the public's right to know and the private protection of the powerful. Bondi's assistants shifted nervously, hands clenching and unclenching. Jasmine let the silence linger, a careful, strategic pause that allowed the weight of her words to sink in. Then, with a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, she continued, "We have witnesses ready to testify, internal communications that cannot be ignored, and evidence that will show the deliberate decisions made in your office. Denial is not enough. The truth is coming to light, and there will be consequences." The subtle quiver in Bondi's composure became more pronounced. Her carefully constructed narrative was under siege, and Jasmine's methodical presentation of evidence made it clear that there was no easy escape. The courtroom was now a crucible where reputations, power, and the public's trust would be tested. In that moment, the stakes crystallized. This was no longer just a political confrontation. It was a moral reckoning, a public exposure of a system that had shielded the guilty while silencing the victims. And Jasmine Crockett, with unwavering resolve, was leading the charge, ensuring that the truth would not be buried. Asterisk, the courtroom fell into a charged silence as the doors opened and the whistleblower was ushered in. Known only as Agent X, the former Department of Justice official had requested anonymity for fear of retaliation, but the gravity of their testimony promised to pierce the veil of secrecy that Bondi had so carefully constructed. Jasmine's eyes followed the figure as they took the stand, a mix of nervousness and resolve in their posture. This was the moment where allegations would transform into first-hand revelations, where documents and rumors would crystallize into truth. Agent X's voice, measured but trembling slightly under the weight of what they were about to disclose, filled the room. "I was instructed repeatedly to delay certain files related to Jeffrey Epstein. These instructions came directly from Attorney General Bondi's office. I understood them as orders to suppress evidence that could be damaging to influential individuals connected to Epstein." A murmur ran through the chamber. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every subtle reaction Bondi's tightening jaw. Aides whispering urgently, journalists scribbling feverishly. The testimony was precise, cutting through layers of obfuscation with a surgical clarity. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice calm but insistent. "Can you clarify whether these were standard procedural delays or deliberate actions to withhold information?" "They were deliberate," Agent X said firmly. "Emails, phone calls, meeting notes all point to conscious decisions to prevent the release of material that would expose Epstein's associates. It wasn't bureaucratic delay. It was obstruction." Jasmine's hand brushed over the stack of evidence before her, each page a fragment of a larger, damning mosaic. "And you saw this pattern repeated over time?" she asked, voice steady, drawing the audience into the narrative as if they were sitting in the room themselves. "Repeated directives to stall, to mislead, to protect the powerful at the expense of justice?" "Yes," Agent X replied. "I saw it repeatedly. Decisions were made with knowledge of the consequences for the victims. It was a coordinated effort within the DOJ, originating from Bondi's office." Outside the courtroom, live feeds exploded with activity. Social media platforms lit up with clips of the testimony, hashtags surged, and news anchors dissected every nuance of the whistleblower's statements. Millions of Americans who had followed the Epstein scandal for years felt the sting of betrayal all over again as they absorbed the implications. Jasmine's voice softened slightly, turning from accusation to reflection, drawing the human stakes into stark relief. "These are not just memos, not just emails," she said. They are the voices of those who were silenced, whose suffering was compounded by those sworn to uphold justice. You were part of that system. Agent X, your courage today is about ensuring they are finally heard. Agent X nodded, her eyes glinting with the tension of speaking truth to power. I did what I could. I've carried this knowledge for too long. The victims deserve more than silence. Bondi's expression remained carefully controlled, but the slightest flicker of unease betrayed the effect the testimony was having. Even the most seasoned political operators sensed the power of first-hand evidence against her, and the courtroom atmosphere thickened with moral gravity. Jasmine pressed further, her tone deliberate, cinematic, pulling the audience into the unfolding drama. Were there attempts to keep this from Congress? Were other officials complicit in these decisions? Yes, Agent X confirmed. There was coordination, emails exchanged between offices, instructions passed down the chain of command. It was systematic. The room absorbed the weight of that admission. Systematic, deliberate, and rooted in the highest levels of power. Jasmine allowed a beat of silence to hang, letting the implications settle in. This was not just a political scandal. It was a moral indictment, a public reckoning with the institutions designed to protect citizens that had instead shielded abusers. As the whistleblower concluded their testimony, Jasmine's eyes met Bondi's across the room. The moment was cinematic, a tableau of confrontation, authority, and impending accountability. The nation will hear this, Jasmine said, her voice unwavering. And justice, long delayed, will not be denied any longer. Cameras captured the subtle trembling of Bondi's hands, the whispers of aides, the quiet determination in Jasmine's posture. Agent X stepped down, leaving behind a courtroom transformed. A public now armed with irrefutable testimony, and a legal battle whose stakes had just escalated to the highest level. Outside, the media frenzy was immediate. Clips of Agent X's testimony flooded news cycles. Commentators debated, analysts unpacked, and the public waited with bated breath. The story had shifted from accusation to documented revelation, and the momentum was unstoppable. In that charged atmosphere, Jasmine Crockett remained resolute, a figure of moral authority and strategic precision, poised to carry this narrative into the next chapter, where the deeper mechanics of the cover-up and Bondi's deliberate choices would be laid bare for all to see. Asterisk, the courtroom was charged with a quiet, simmering intensity, as though every eye present understood they were witnessing the unraveling of carefully guarded deception. Investigative journalists stepped forward, sliding folders across the polished surface of the podium, each packet a revelation in itself. Jasmine Crockett's gaze swept over the room, absorbing the stunned expressions of officials, reporters, and spectators alike. The evidence was no longer abstract. It was a tangible chain of deliberate actions, designed to obscure the truth about Jeffrey Epstein and those he protected. These documents, Jasmine began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of moral urgency, show a coordinated pattern of obstruction originating from the highest levels of the Department of Justice. Internal communications reveal that Pam Bondi's office issued directives to delay the release of files, to instruct investigators to withhold evidence, and to frame these actions as standard protocol. This was not error. This was deception. Bondi shifted slightly in her seat, the practiced calm she had relied on beginning to fray under the relentless illumination of facts. An aide discreetly whispered into her ear, but Bondi's eyes remained fixed forward, betraying the first flickers of doubt. A journalist rose, presenting another tranche of emails. In these messages, the reporter explained, agents expressed concern over the legality of withholding records. They were repeatedly overruled by instructions from Bondi's office. The rationale given strategic discretion appears to have been a euphemism for deliberate suppression. Jasmine's voice cut through the murmurs. Strategic discretion, she repeated, letting the words linger like a warning. Discretion that ensured victims' voices were silenced while the powerful remained protected. This is not justice. It is manipulation of the system for personal and political gain. The courtroom absorbed her words in tense silence. Outside, media feeds began buzzing, sending ripples across social platforms. Clips of Jasmine presenting emails, interspersed with close-ups of Bondi's stoic yet tense expression, circulated rapidly, igniting public debate and outrage. Millions of Americans were witnessing the erosion of trust in real time. Jasmine turned back to the evidence. Handwritten notes on sensitive files showed repeated instructions. Do not release. Delay for review. Prioritize confidentiality over disclosure. Every line of instruction traced back to Bondi's office, painting a clear picture of deliberate obstruction. Ms. Bondi, Jasmine said, her tone quiet but razor-sharp, you were given a choice. Uphold the law or shield the guilty. You chose concealment. These emails, these memos, these instructions, they are evidence of a deliberate pattern of deception. How do you respond? Bondi's voice, measured but defensive, filled the room. I acted in accordance with legal and procedural guidelines. At no point was there an intent to obstruct justice. These decisions were made to protect the integrity of ongoing investigations. Jasmine stepped closer, letting her presence fill the space between accusation and accountability. Integrity? Integrity would have meant transparency. Integrity would have meant giving victims a voice. Your office chose secrecy, delay, and concealment. The pattern is unmistakable, and the evidence is irrefutable. A hush settled over the chamber. The weight of her words, combined with the meticulously documented evidence, created a palpable tension that seemed to press against the walls themselves. It was more than political theater. It was a moral indictment. Each document, each memo, each directive demonstrated a calculated effort to mislead the public and protect the guilty, and the courtroom felt the gravity of it collectively. Illegal. Analyst whispered to a colleague, "This goes beyond incompetence. This is coordinated." The phrase hung in the air like a verdict yet to be delivered. Jasmine allowed a pause, letting the silence underscore the enormity of the revelations. She did not need to raise her voice. The weight of the evidence spoke louder than words ever could. Then, softly but with unmistakable conviction, she concluded. The system was manipulated, victims were silenced, and justice delayed. The truth, however, cannot be hidden forever. Today, it comes to light. Bondi's composure was now visibly strained. Her calm demeanor had been chipped away by evidence, testimony, and the moral force of Jasmine's presentation. The chamber sensed the shift. What had begun as a standard hearing had become an exposure of deliberate, systemic obstruction, and the momentum now rested firmly in Jasmine's hands. Outside, the public reaction was instantaneous. News outlets replayed every email, every memo, every damning note. Social media erupted, debates ignited, and for the first time in months, the focus was not on legal procedure, but on the moral consequences of concealment. In the charged stillness that followed, Jasmine's eyes remained locked on Bondi, not with malice, but with the determination of someone carrying the weight of truth. This was no longer speculation. This was undeniable reality. And it was only the beginning. The room felt smaller now, as though the weight of truth had physically pressed the walls closer together. Word of Jasmine Crockett's revelations had spread like wildfire. Former allies, political operatives, and even members of Bondi's own party were beginning to shift uneasily in their seats. The fractures within the Republican ranks were subtle at first. Hesitant glances, carefully worded statements, a slight withdrawal of public support, but the tremors were undeniable. Jasmine's courtroom presence had become a fulcrum for the shifting political landscape. The hearings continued, but now they were about more than just evidence. They were about accountability, public trust, and political survival. Jasmine addressed the chamber with a quiet intensity, her voice carrying over the low murmur of whispered conversations. "The pattern is clear," she said. "Actions taken in secrecy, intended to protect the guilty, cannot stand. The office of the Attorney General exists to uphold justice, not to shield predators." Bondi's gaze flickered toward a colleague seated beside her. "These accusations are politically motivated," she said, the words carefully measured, meant to deflect and reframe. Jasmine's response was calm, precise, and cutting. "Perhaps," she said, "but the evidence does not lie. And history will judge those who put politics above justice." Outside the courtroom, the first waves of political fallout began to emerge. Former allies, previously reluctant to criticize Bondi publicly, now issued statements questioning her judgment. Editorial boards and opinion pieces dissected the unfolding. Scandal, noting the growing divide within the party. The narrative was shifting. Bondi was no longer a figure of untouchable authority. She was a politician in retreat, cornered by the very institutions she had sworn to lead. Inside, the hearings took on a new dimension. Former colleagues of Bondi, appearing as witnesses, recounted their own discomfort and dissent. Their testimonies, hesitant yet increasingly candid, painted a picture of an office in conflict with itself, a chain of command strained by ethical and legal dilemmas. Jasmine's questioning was strategic, drawing out the human elements, the moral tension, and the consequences of the decisions made under Bondi's leadership. "Did you feel pressured to withhold information?" Jasmine asked one witness, her tone steady but piercing. "Yes," the witness admitted, voice low and hesitant. "The instructions came from the top. There was no room to question them without risking our positions." Jasmine nodded slightly, allowing the room to absorb the weight of that confession. "And the victims?" she pressed gently. "Were their rights considered in any of these decisions?" The witness swallowed hard. "No, their needs were secondary. Everything was calculated to protect powerful individuals connected to Epstein." The courtroom seemed to vibrate with a tension that went beyond the legal. This was a confrontation of moral and political gravity. Each admission, each pause, each carefully chosen word deepened the fissures within Bondi's support network. Allies who had once stood firmly by her side were now wavering, hesitant to defend a record that was increasingly indefensible. Jasmine shifted her attention slightly, her eyes sweeping the room with deliberate intensity. "The question is no longer whether mistakes were made," she said. "The question is whether the public can trust those who lead. Decisions made in secrecy, at the expense of justice, demand accountability. And those who enabled concealment must answer for their choices." Bondi's composure was fraying. The aides who had once whispered assurances now looked uneasy, exchanging brief glances that betrayed their growing concern. The political calculations that had once protected her seemed insufficient against the moral clarity Jasmine brought to every question, every piece of evidence, every witness testimony. Outside, social media erupted. Analysts speculated on the internal divisions within the party. Opinion polls began to reflect a loss of confidence. Former supporters issued cautious statements, seeking to distance themselves from the scandal without directly condemning Bondi, but the shift was undeniable. Inside the courtroom, Jasmine's voice cut through the tension once more. "Public trust is not a commodity to be hoarded or manipulated. It is earned and maintained by integrity and transparency. When those in power choose otherwise, it is our duty to expose it and to ensure that justice prevails." The room absorbed her, words in heavy, contemplative silence. The political fallout was no longer a rumor or threat, it was a tangible force, reshaping alliances, shaking loyalties, and signaling a new chapter in the ongoing reckoning with Epstein's legacy. As Jasmine returned to her seat, eyes steady and unwavering, it was clear that this battle was no longer just legal, It was a seismic shift in the moral and political landscape. The nation was watching, and the era of unaccountable power was beginning to fracture. Asterisk, the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Cameras lined every wall, their lenses trained on the witness stand were survivors of Epstein's abuse. Were about to speak. Jasmine Crockett sat poised, a quiet storm of determination and empathy radiating from her. This was the human dimension of the scandal. The voices that had been silenced for years, now stepping forward to tell their stories in a space that demanded truth. The first survivor rose slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the stand. Jasmine offered a small, reassuring nod, a gesture that was both grounding and empowering. The woman's eyes, rimmed with unshed tears, swept the room as she began to recount the horrors she had endured. "I was just a child," she said, voice soft but firm. "And the people who were supposed to protect me turned away. Instead, they protected him. And when I tried to speak, the system buried my voice. A hush fell over the chamber. Even the most seasoned journalists and officials seemed momentarily stunned into silence. Jasmine's presence was steady, her eyes locked on the survivor, absorbing every word and ensuring the testimony was met with the respect it deserved. "Your courage is the light cutting through years of darkness," Jasmine said quietly, her voice carrying both empathy and strength. "We will not let your story be ignored." Another survivor took the stand, her narrative equally harrowing, but with a different emphasis on betrayal, not just by Epstein, but by those like Bondi who had allowed concealment to persist. "We sent letters, we asked for investigations, and we were told to wait," she recounted. "Documents were hidden, evidence disappeared, and every time we raised our voices, we were silenced. Pam Bondi's office could have acted. She chose not to." The courtroom seemed to vibrate with the weight of these words. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but precise, drawing out the emotional truth and linking it directly to the evidence already presented. The memos, the emails, the directives to delay, this is not abstract bureaucratic process. This is deliberate disregard for human suffering. We are here to ensure that those choices are confronted. Bondi's jaw tightened. Her aides whispered frantically, but Jasmine's methodical pacing left no room for distraction. Each survivor's testimony compounded the narrative, a mosaic of pain, obstruction, and deliberate concealment. Social media feeds exploded in real time as clips of these moments were shared, creating waves of outrage across the nation. Public opinion, long simmering beneath the surface, was now a tidal wave. One survivor, shaking but resolute, looked directly at Bondi. "You had the power to act. You had the responsibility. And you chose to protect him, not us." Jasmine's response was both fierce and empathetic. No more silence. No more deflection. Today, the truth is being told, and justice will not be postponed any longer. Her words were not only for the courtroom, but for millions watching from their homes, listening to the voices that had been ignored for too long. The witnesses. Stories were interwoven with the evidence presented earlier, the memos, emails, and internal directives that bore Bondi's imprint. Every revelation reinforced the larger narrative, a deliberate obstruction of justice, a betrayal of public trust, and the human cost of those decisions. Jasmine's strategy was meticulous, blending emotional resonance with legal and political clarity, ensuring that the moral stakes were impossible to dismiss. Even outside the walls of the hearing room, the impact was seismic. News outlets replayed survivor testimony in its entirety. Analysts discussed the implications on morning shows and social media platforms. Hashtags surged, highlighting victim advocacy and calling for accountability. Millions felt the moral weight of the scandal firsthand. Jasmine allowed a moment of silence between witnesses, letting the gravity of each story settle over the room. She was not just a politician or lawyer, she was a conduit for truth, amplifying voices long silenced and ensuring that they were seen, heard, and respected. As the final survivor concluded her testimony, the courtroom erupted in a quiet, respectful acknowledgement. The moral and emotional stakes had shifted irrevocably. Bondi's carefully constructed defenses now faced the undeniable human cost of her inaction. Jasmine's eyes met Bondi's across the room. There was no malice, only unwavering resolve. "The nation has heard you," she said softly, "and they will remember. Accountability is no longer optional, it is inevitable." The chamber absorbed her words. The courtroom, already heavy with tension, now seemed charged with purpose. Every journalist, every aide, every official present understood that this was more than testimony. It was a reckoning, and Jasmine Crockett was leading it with courage, precision, and an unflinching commitment to justice. The courtroom had transformed into a theater of confrontation. The evidence, the whistleblower testimony, and the survivors' voices had shifted the balance of power. Every spectator, journalist, and aide in the room could feel that Bondi's carefully maintained facade of control was fracturing under the relentless scrutiny of truth. Jasmine Crockett stood again, her posture precise, commanding attention without raising her voice. "This is not just a matter of procedure or politics," Jasmine began, her tone calm yet sharp enough to cut through the low murmurs. "This is a matter of accountability. The directives, emails, and memos presented here are irrefutable. They chart a deliberate course to protect Jeffrey Epstein and his associates while silencing the victims." Bondi adjusted in her seat, but the motion was subtle, betraying the tension behind the composed exterior. Her aides whispered, documents rustling, trying to shore up defenses that were increasingly untenable. Jasmine continued, each word calculated, cinematic, and laden with moral weight. "Let us be clear," Jasmine said, voice steady. "The Department of Justice is entrusted with the public's trust. When that trust is breached, when instructions are issued to withhold evidence, it is not simply a bureaucratic lapse, it is a moral failure. And that failure originates at the top." She gestured toward the stacks of documentation before her, now augmented by testimony from Bondi's former colleagues who had reluctantly come forward. "These are not isolated incidents. They are patterns repeated and corroborated. Internal communications reveal that your office knowingly delayed the release of files, directed investigators to avoid certain lines of questioning, and prioritized political considerations over justice." Bondi's lips pressed into a thin line. Her defenses, once confident, were now beginning to look brittle, paper-thin in the glare of Jasmine's methodical dismantling. "All actions were consistent with legal guidance," Bondi responded, measured but strained. No intent to mislead or obstruct was present. Intent, Jasmine thought, but did not voice. Instead, she let the evidence speak. Emails with timestamps, memos marked with Bondi's signature, and internal notes outlining the strategy to contain the Epstein investigation painted a picture far beyond procedural misjudgment. "Legal guidance does not justify silencing victims," Jasmine said softly, "but with the weight of an indictment. You were aware of the consequences. You made a conscious decision to protect the powerful and suppress the truth." The courtroom held its collective breath. Even the aides seemed to shrink under the intensity of the presentation. Cameras captured every subtle movement, the tightening of jaws, the subtle flick of an eye toward supportive colleagues, the unsteady breath that betrayed Bondi's composure. Outside, live feeds and social media exploded. Clips circulated instantly, snippets of emails, testimony, and Jasmine's precise, moral framing of the case. The nation was watching, and the stakes had never been higher. A senior legal analyst whispered to a colleague, "This is beyond political theater. This is a public reckoning." Jasmine, hearing nothing but the rhythm of the courtroom, pressed on, moving seamlessly between facts, testimony, and the human consequences of concealment. Every memo, every delayed file, every silenced voice tells a story, she said, voice low but insistent. The victim's pain cannot be minimized. The public deserves accountability, and today we are here to assure it is delivered. Bondi's defense faltered. The careful narrative she had relied upon for months, the idea that delays were procedural, that nothing was intentional, was crumbling under the weight of evidence, testimony, and public scrutiny. Every denial now rang hollow, a thin shield against the mounting moral and political pressure. Jasmine paused, letting the silence hang like a physical presence. It was a pause for impact, a cinematic beat in the unfolding drama. Cameras captured the moment, and outside, viewers felt the tension through their screens. The courtroom was no longer just a place of hearings. It had become a stage for accountability. Truth and justice. Then, softly but firmly, Jasmine concluded, the pattern is undeniable. The consequences are real. The time for evasion is over. The nation is watching, and justice, long delayed, will not be denied any longer. Bondi's posture stiffened. Her aides exchanged hurried glances, and the media recorded every nuance. The courtroom had shifted irrevocably. What began as an investigation had become a moral crucible, a test of integrity and a spectacle of accountability. Jasmine had set the tone, and the momentum was undeniable. The stage was now set for the next act, with a public reckoning. Media scrutiny and political consequences would converge, ensuring that the revelations could no longer be ignored. Asterisk. The story had leapt from the courtroom into every corner of the nation. Television screens flickered with Jasmine Crockett's precise exposition, while news websites ran continuous live updates. Social media feeds exploded with clips of the whistleblower, survivor testimonies, and the damning emails from Bondi's office. Hashtags surged, trending across platforms, as millions of Americans confronted the truth they had long suspected but had not yet seen so fully exposed. The public outrage was tangible, almost physical, pressing against the walls of power. With unstoppable force, inside the courtroom, Jasmine observed the reactions of the media and the officials alike. Every camera angle, every journalist's notepad, every live feed captured the meticulous unfolding of evidence. This is not about spectacle, Jasmine said quietly, her voice carrying conviction across the room. It's about accountability, transparency, and the fundamental rights of victims who were silenced for too long. Bondi sat with a carefully controlled composure, yet the tension around her was palpable. Her aides whispered urgently, papers shuffled, and every subtle gesture revealed the cracks in the facade that had protected her until now. The courtroom had become a stage not just for legal proceedings, but for national judgment. The media coverage amplified every moment. Broadcast segments juxtaposed images of Jasmine, presenting evidence with headlines flashing phrases like obstruction exposed and Bondi under fire. Online commentary dissected every memo, every email, every witness account, making the courtroom revelations accessible to millions in real time. Jasmine understood the power of narrative. Each presentation, each pointed question, each revelation was carefully framed to resonate not only with those present, but with a watching nation, demanding justice. A legal analyst on live television summarized what the public was beginning to grasp. This isn't just an investigation, it's a full-scale exposure of systemic obstruction. The documents show a clear pattern, and the witnesses confirm it. Pam Bondi's office is facing a crisis of credibility the likes of which are rarely seen. Jasmine leaned into the microphone again, her presence calm but commanding. The documents reveal a deliberate attempt to bury evidence, to delay investigations, and to shield those connected to Jeffrey Epstein. We are witnessing the consequences, of protecting the powerful at the expense of justice. And the nation is watching. Outside the courtroom, citizens engaged in real-time discourse. News segments were clipped and shared, dissected, and debated in comment threads, opinion pieces, and public forums. The moral gravity of the revelations created a wave of civic engagement. The public outrage was not just emotional, it was analytical, informed by the meticulously presented evidence that Jasmine had delivered. Bondi's defenses, once carefully rehearsed, faltered under the relentless glare of public scrutiny. Media framed the story as more than a legal battle, it was a moral confrontation, a challenge to the integrity of the justice system itself. Every email, every memo, and every witness statement was magnified, examined, and broadcast, leaving little room for denial or evasion. Jasmine's voice carried across the room, softening only slightly to convey empathy for the victims. The system failed them. Decisions were made in secrecy, voices silenced, and justice postponed. But the truth cannot be contained. The exposure of these actions is a necessary step toward accountability, and it cannot be ignored. Bondi's expression, though carefully neutral, betrayed the pressure building around her. Every public reaction, every trending clip, every viral post intensified the scrutiny. The courtroom was no longer the center of events. It was a focal point for national judgment, and Jasmine's strategy ensured that the momentum could not be reversed. The chamber seemed to pulse with tension. Journalists whispered in corners, aides exchanged hurried glances, and officials watched the unfolding narrative with apprehension. Jasmine's calculated pacing had ensured that every revelation landed with impact, every moral point crystallized, and every public observer understood the stakes. Finally, Jasmine allowed the moment to settle. "The exposure is complete," she said, voice resolute. "The nation has witnessed the decisions made in secrecy, the harm caused by deliberate concealment, and the courage of those who spoke truth to power. Justice delayed may have been tolerated for too long, but accountability is now inevitable." As the room absorbed her words, the media frenzy continued to escalate. The courtroom had become more than a site of legal proceedings. It was a catalyst for public reckoning, civic engagement, and a national confrontation with truth. Jasmine Crockett had ensured that the scandal, long shrouded in secrecy, would now be impossible to ignore. The courtroom had become a crucible of accountability, and the tension inside was palpable. Bondi's once unassailable authority now seemed tenuous. Each word and gesture scrutinized under the collective gaze of journalists, officials, and a nation watching through live streams. Jasmine Crockett moved with precision, orchestrating each moment, ensuring that the evidence, testimony, and moral weight converged into an unstoppable force. "This is no longer about opinion or political affiliation," Jasmine said, her voice carrying through the chamber like a bell tolling. "The arrival of truth. This is about responsibility." The decisions made in secrecy by Attorney General Bondi's office were deliberate. Emails, memos, and directives all confirm that knowledge of Epstein's actions was deliberately concealed. This is obstruction. Plain and simple. Bondi's lips pressed tightly together. Her aides shifted uneasily, papers rustling like the whispers of conscience. "I acted within the scope of my office," Bondi replied, measured yet faltering. "Decisions were made to preserve the integrity of ongoing investigations. There was no intent to mislead or obstruct." Jasmine leaned slightly forward, voice low but cutting. "Integrity cannot coexist with silence. Integrity cannot exist when victims are denied justice. The records show a pattern of intentional suppression, and witnesses have confirmed this repeatedly. Your office had the authority to act, and you chose not to." The courtroom seemed to pulse with collective tension. Cameras captured every flicker of emotion, every twitch of a hand, every subtle change in posture. Outside, The media amplified each moment clips of Jasmine's precise, methodical dismantling of Bondi's defenses went viral within minutes. Public outrage intensified, fueled by a blend of moral indignation and clear evidence. A former aide, called to the stand reluctantly, recounted the pressure from Bondi's office to delay investigations. "I was told multiple times to hold back records," the aide admitted, voice trembling. "It felt wrong. We knew victims were being denied justice, but the instructions were explicit: protect certain individuals, delay disclosure, and maintain confidentiality." Jasmine's tone softened just enough to convey empathy while maintaining unwavering authority. "You did what you could under the circumstances," she said, "but the decisions at the top made that resistance nearly impossible. That is the failure we are confronting here, the deliberate obstruction that placed political calculation above human suffering." Bondi's defenses were weakening. The weight of testimony, evidence, and public scrutiny made denial increasingly hollow. Every witness, every document, every email pushed her further into the corner. She attempted to regain control. Decisions were legal and consistent with guidance. "No one in my office acted to harm victims deliberately." Jasmine's eyes locked onto Bondi's, unflinching. "Legal guidance cannot justify moral failure. Protecting the powerful while silencing the vulnerable is not consistent with justice. It is betrayal. And betrayal has consequences." The courtroom absorbed the gravity of her words. Even Bondi's closest allies could no longer ignore the pattern of obstruction, the human cost, and the moral reckoning unfolding in real time. The room was no longer just a stage for a legal dispute. It had become a public tribunal, with every journalist, official, and witness functioning as part of an audience that demanded accountability. Outside, the reaction was instantaneous. Analysts debated every angle. Editorial boards published damning evaluations, and public figures were forced to respond. Social media amplified the testimonies, the evidence, and Jasmine's moral framing, ensuring that the narrative of concealment and betrayal dominated the national conversation. Jasmine allowed a moment of silence to hang, letting the moral weight settle. "This is not speculation. This is documented fact," she said, voice low, firm, and cinematic. "Every decision made to suppress evidence, every instruction to withhold files, every delay that prolonged suffering, it is here, in black and white, for the world to see. Justice delayed is no longer tolerated." Bondi's hands tightened subtly in her lap. Her gaze shifted briefly to the jury of public opinion, the cameras, the journalists, the nation itself, and then back to Jasmine, who remained calm, precise, and unwavering. The confrontation had reached its zenith. The courtroom was now stage for ultimate accountability, a reckoning that transcended politics and procedural defenses. The silence that followed was electric, a pause that signaled the climax of moral confrontation. Jasmine Crockett had not only presented evidence, she had framed it in the context of human suffering, public trust, and ethical responsibility. The narrative was undeniable: deliberate obstruction, systemic concealment, and the betrayal of victims' rights. And in that charged atmosphere, every observer understood one thing with absolute clarity: the era of unaccountable power had been exposed, and the consequences were imminent. The courtroom had reached a stillness that felt almost sacred, heavy with the weight of evidence, testimony, and moral reckoning. Jasmine Crockett stood with unwavering resolve, the culmination of weeks of investigation, confrontation, and meticulous preparation coalescing into this defining moment. Every witness, every memo, every testimony had led to this point, an undeniable exposure of deliberate obstruction and betrayal. The truth cannot be buried. Jasmine began, her voice calm yet charged with moral authority. Every decision made by Attorney General Bondi's office to withhold information, to delay investigations, to protect powerful individuals at the expense of victims is documented. The nation has witnessed the pattern, the consequences, and the courage of those who spoke despite fear. Bondi's posture stiffened. Her composure, so carefully maintained for months, now felt brittle under the relentless clarity of the evidence and the moral framing Jasmine had presented. "I acted according to legal guidance," she repeated, voice firm but lacking conviction. "No harm was intended." "No harm intended?" Jasmine echoed, her tone razor-sharp. "Let us not mince words. The harm was real. Lives were disrupted. Voices were silenced. Justice was delayed, and you were in a position to prevent it. You chose otherwise." The courtroom seemed to pulse with tension. Journalists leaned forward, capturing every syllable, while officials and aides exchanged anxious glances. The cameras broadcasted the confrontation live, and millions across the nation watched, riveted by the moral clarity of the moment. A witness, previously hesitant, stepped forward one final time. "We tried to speak," they said, voice trembling yet resolute. "We were ignored. We were silenced. And now, for the first time, the truth is being seen. It is a relief, but it is long overdue." Jasmine nodded, her gaze sweeping the room and resting on Bondi. The public deserves more than delay, more than excuses. They deserve transparency, accountability, and justice. Today, we ensure that those principles are not mere words. They are lived realities. Bondi's hands clenched subtly in her lap. She opened her mouth to respond, but the weight of evidence and the moral force of Jasmine's narrative left her silent. Each memo, each testimony, each whistleblower account had stacked upon the next, forming a wall of accountability impossible to dismantle. Outside the courtroom, media outlets replayed every moment. Headlines screamed revelations, opinion pieces, dissected the consequences, and social media erupted with a chorus of outrage, support, and demands for further investigation. The nation collectively absorbed the culmination of years of obfuscation, manipulation, and concealment. Jasmine's strategic presentation had not only revealed the truth, but ensured it could not be ignored. She turned slightly toward the court, her voice steady and resolute. "This is the power of truth. This is what happens when courage meets accountability, when those who were silenced are finally heard, and when the actions of the powerful are exposed for what they are." The room seemed to hold its breath, the cinematic tension at its peak. Every eye, every camera lens, every observer online felt the weight of history pressing in. Jasmine's methodical dismantling of Bondi's defenses, combined with the human impact of the survivors' testimonies, had created a narrative that could not be dismissed, spun, or minimized. Bondi finally looked down, a subtle acknowledgement of the irreversible shift in the courtroom's energy. Jasmine continued, softening only slightly to convey the human triumph embedded in justice. "This is not about revenge. This is about restoration. Restoration of trust, restoration of faith in the system, and restoration of dignity to those who were wronged." A palpable silence followed her words. Cameras captured the intensity, journalists scribbled furiously, and aides whispered behind their hands. Outside, millions of viewers shared the same realization. Accountability had finally reached the threshold of action, and the consequences for obstruction, concealment, and betrayal were unavoidable. Jasmine's eyes met those of the survivors, a quiet, cinematic acknowledgement passing between them. The courtroom had borne witness to courage, truth, and moral clarity. Bondi, for the first time in months, appeared cornered not politically, but ethically. And as Jasmine stepped back, allowing the weight of the revelations to settle fully, the chamber seemed to exhale. The scandal had been exposed, the obstruction laid bare, and the nation had seen justice demand its due. The era of silence, delay, and protection of the powerful was ending. Jasmine Crockett had not only presented the facts, but had crafted a narrative of moral authority and human consequence that ensured the truth could no longer be ignored. The reckoning was complete, and the world had watched every moment of it. The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's relentless pursuit of truth reverberated far beyond the polished floors and oak-paneled walls. Reporters, flooded hallways, their microphones still capturing fragments of testimony, while outside, protesters and supporters alike gathered, holding signs demanding accountability, transparency, and justice. The scandal had transcended the courtroom. It had become a national conversation dot in the press room. Journalists scrolled through stacks of documents, piecing together the full magnitude of Bondi's actions. Each memo, email, and internal note became a headline. Every witness statement, every survivor testimony was analyzed for nuance and moral clarity. The narrative Jasmine had constructed of deliberate obstruction, systemic concealment, and betrayal of victims was now undeniable, forming a framework for national outrage and political reckoning. Political analysts debated fiercely on live television. "This goes beyond partisan lines," one commentator said. "What we've witnessed is a clear failure of accountability within a major public office. The public has a right to demand answers, and the ripple effects are just beginning." Jasmine emerged from the courthouse, her posture composed but purposeful. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, questions volleyed in rapid succession. "Miss Crockett, do you believe justice has been served?" one asked. Jasmine's gaze swept. The crowd, calm but unwavering. "Justice is not an event, it's a process. Today, we have unveiled the truth, but the work is far from over. Accountability must continue, and victims' voices must remain at the center of every step forward." Bondi remained largely silent, her aides working to control the narrative, issuing statements emphasizing procedural compliance and legal guidance. But public trust had shifted irrevocably. Social media amplified survivor voices, while investigative reports dissected every delay, memo, and instruction that had suppressed evidence. The nation's attention had crystallized, and the weight of moral judgment pressed upon those once considered untouchable. Survivors and advocacy groups gathered outside, meeting Jasmine with gratitude and cautious hope. "You've given us a voice," one survivor said, tears glinting in the morning light. "For the first time, it feels like we're being heard. Not just in the courtroom, but everywhere." Jasmine nodded, absorbing the moment with solemn pride. "Your courage made this possible," she replied. "It is your stories, your truth, that hold those in power accountable. Today, the nation sees what you endured and the demand for justice is now unmistakable." Political ripples continued to spread. Lawmakers, previously hesitant to confront Bondi, began questioning her publicly. Editorial boards called for hearings. Congressional committees discussed investigations, and watchdog groups mobilized to ensure transparency in future cases. The scandal had ignited a broader conversation about ethical leadership, public trust, and the consequences of prioritizing political convenience over human dignity. Even the media, saturated with footage of courtroom confrontations, survivor testimonies, and Jasmine's methodical dismantling of obstruction, emphasized the unprecedented clarity she had brought to the case. "Crockett has turned legal procedure into a moral indictment," one analyst said. "She has not only exposed wrongdoing, she has framed it in human terms that the public cannot ignore." As dusk settled over the city, Jasmine walked alone, for a moment, reflecting on the journey from confidential documents to national reckoning. The courtroom battle was only one chapter. The larger struggle for justice, systemic reform, and survivor advocacy would continue. But the impact of today's exposure was undeniable. A pattern of secrecy had been shattered. Accountability demanded, and the nation's conscience awakened. Her eyes lifted to the skyline. a subtle determination in their depth. The truth cannot be silenced, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. And it will continue to guide us until justice is not just a promise, but a reality. In the quiet aftermath, it was clear. The scandal had reshaped public perception, shifted political power, and empowered survivors. Jasmine Crockett had transformed a legal confrontation into a movement for moral clarity, leaving a lasting mark on both the courtroom and the conscience of the nation that the nation was watching. And this time, justice, though long delayed, could not be denied. Asterisk. Weeks had passed since the courtroom showdown, but the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's relentless pursuit of truth continued to reverberate through Washington, the media, and the nation at large. The initial shock of revelation had given way to sustained scrutiny, political debate, and an intensified public demand for accountability. Bondi's attempts at damage control had faltered under the weight of the evidence, leaving a trail of political and ethical consequences that could not be ignored. In the halls of power, whispers became urgent conversations, and conversations became action. Congressional committees opened inquiries, watchdog organizations intensified investigations, and public discourse reflected a rare clarity. Deliberate concealment and obstruction, no matter how high-ranking the official, would no longer be tolerated. Jasmine's meticulous approach had transformed what could have been a procedural dispute into a moral reckoning that the nation could witness in real time. Outside, survivors began speaking more openly, empowered by the courage of those who had stepped forward first. "We finally have a voice," one said during a panel discussion streamed live, "and the public is listening. That's because people like Jasmine made it impossible to ignore our truth." Jasmine, seated in the front row, allowed a quiet smile of acknowledgement. She had never sought fame or acclaim, only justice, and the amplification of voices that had been silenced for too long. The media continued to dissect the case, highlighting not just the obstruction, but the broader lessons it revealed about ethical leadership. Editorial boards praised Jasmine's unwavering commitment to both legal rigor and moral clarity, framing her as a model of integrity in an era where power often shielded wrongdoing. Viral clips of her courtroom strategies circulated endlessly, online, sparking discussions in classrooms, community forums, and even boardrooms about the importance of accountability and transparency. Jasmine herself remained focused on the ongoing work. "The courtroom was just the beginning," she told a gathering of advocacy leaders. "Exposing wrongdoing is essential, but we must ensure the system evolves to prevent it from happening again. Justice is not only about punishment, it is about creating a framework where the powerless are protected and those in authority are held to the highest standard." Bondi's political career had taken a noticeable hit. Allies distanced themselves, and public trust eroded significantly. The combination of documentary evidence, survivor testimony, and Jasmine's strategic framing had created a permanent record that could not be erased. Every memo and email that had once been buried under layers of bureaucracy now stood as proof of systemic failure and moral compromise. Across the nation, citizens reflected on the lessons of the case. Activists, lawyers, and policymakers cited the exposure as a catalyst for reform. Education programs emphasized ethical responsibility and transparency in governance. Social media campaigns encouraged civic engagement and demanded vigilance against the concealment of wrongdoing. Jasmine's work had inspired not just immediate accountability, but a cultural shift in how power and responsibility were perceived. In the quiet moments after hearings and media cycles, Jasmine often reflected on the journey that had begun with the first suppressed memo, the first silenced voice. Every step forward, every revelation, every story heard, she whispered to herself, is a testament to what courage and persistence can achieve. Her resolve remained undiminished. The pursuit of justice, when grounded in truth and moral Clarity could transform systems and lives alike. And as the sun set over the city, bathing the courthouse in a golden, almost cinematic light, it was clear that this was more than a political victory. It was a moral triumph, a moment when accountability overcame secrecy, and the voices of the silenced finally shaped the narrative. Jasmine Crockett had not only exposed obstruction and corruption, but had illuminated a path forward for justice, integrity, and ethical leadership. The nation had witnessed the reckoning. And for the survivors, the public, and the conscience of the country, the truth would endure long after the cameras stopped rolling and the courtroom doors closed. Asterisk months had passed since the courtroom confrontation, yet the reverberations of Jasmine Crockett's exposure of Bondi's obstruction were still felt in every corner of the political landscape. Investigations continued, and legislation aimed at transparency and ethical oversight had begun to gain traction. What started as a single courtroom case had blossomed into a nationwide movement demanding accountability at all levels of government. Inside congressional offices, aides and lawmakers referenced the memos and witness testimonies daily, drafting policies and proposals designed to prevent similar concealment in the future. Jasmine's strategic presentation of evidence had not only revealed wrongdoing, but created a blueprint for institutional reform. The public will no longer accept secrecy as a shield for the powerful, one aide remarked, quietly acknowledging the moral force Jasmine had unleashed. The survivors, once hesitant and silenced, now spoke with confidence, their voices amplified by the cultural and political momentum Jasmine had generated. Panel discussions, advocacy campaigns, and education programs ensured their stories reached audiences across the nation. "We were ignored for years," one survivor said in a nationally televised interview. "Now people are listening. And that makes all the difference." Bondi's political influence had waned considerably. Even her allies acknowledged the shift in public perception as her office faced increased scrutiny and calls for accountability. It was not just the exposure that mattered. It was Jasmine's framing of the narrative, combining legal precision with moral clarity, and always centering the human impact that made the revelations impossible to dismiss. Academics and ethicists began using the case as a teaching moment. Law schools included modules on ethical responsibility in prosecutorial conduct. Civic organizations emphasized transparency and public accountability as non-negotiable pillars of governance. The case became more than a scandal. It became a cultural touchstone for integrity and courage in public service. Jasmine herself remained vigilant, understanding that public awareness alone would not guarantee systemic change. "Truth is the foundation," she said during a forum with young civic leaders, "but it must be paired with action. Reform, advocacy, and vigilance are essential to ensure the failures we've uncovered are never repeated." Even the media continued to reference the fallout, framing Jasmine's courtroom strategy as a masterclass in combining legal acumen with ethical storytelling. Viral segments, in-depth documentaries, and opinion pieces dissected her methods, praising the way she transformed a procedural dispute into a national moral reckoning. As the nation reflected on the scandal, the broader lesson became clear: no office, no authority, and no official could act above scrutiny. Jasmine Crockett's work had demonstrated that courage, persistence, and moral clarity could expose obstruction, empower the silenced, and create lasting change. In quiet moments, Jasmine looked back on the journey, the suppressed memos, the hesitant witnesses, the courtroom tension, and understood that her role extended far beyond any single trial. "This is about legacy," she whispered, "the kind of accountability that shapes systems, protects the vulnerable, and reminds everyone that integrity matters more than expedience or politics." The country had witnessed a transformation. Silence replaced with truth, inaction replaced with accountability, and secrecy replaced with transparency. Jasmine's pursuit had become a testament not just to justice for a few, but to the ethical responsibilities that define governance, law, and society. As night fell over the city, the courthouse and its surrounding streets lay quiet, yet the movement Jasmine had ignited burned brighter than ever. The reckoning was no longer confined to a courtroom. It had entered the nation's conscience, ensuring that the lessons of the past would continue to shape the future.